Adolf Hitler was born on April 20, 1889, in the small town of Braunau am Inn, situated along the border between Austria and Germany. His father, Alois Hitler, was a strict customs officer with a commanding personality, while his mother, Clara, was gentle, caring, and deeply devoted to her children. This combination of stern discipline from one parent and warm affection from the other formed a complex environment in which young Adolf grew up. He had several siblings, though many of them died young, a common tragedy of the time. The family moved frequently due to his father's work, making it difficult for Hitler to develop long-term friendships or stability. From an early age, Hitler showed a restless nature. He enjoyed drawing, sketching buildings, and imagining grand structures. He was fascinated by stories of heroes, warriors, and the glory of past empires. However, his relationship with formal education was troubled. In primary school, he performed well in certain subjects, especially art, but as he progressed, his grades declined sharply. He clashed with teachers, resisted authority, and displayed little interest in subjects he disliked. His father's insistence that he follow a career in government service created deep resentment, as Hitler dreamed of becoming an artist. At the age of 13, his father's sudden death left the family in a difficult financial position. Although his mother supported his artistic ambitions, he still faced the practical challenge of earning a living. After finishing school without distinction, he moved to Vienna, believing it to be the cultural center where his dreams could take shape. Vienna, however, proved far harsher than he had expected. In 1907, he applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts but was rejected. The rejection struck him deeply, and when he tried again the following year, he failed once more. These setbacks crushed his hopes of a traditional art career and left him adrift. The years that followed were marked by poverty and hardship. Hitler lived in cheap lodgings and sometimes in homeless shelters, making ends meet by selling small paintings and postcards. While surviving in this environment, he was exposed to a city filled with political tensions, nationalist movements, and widespread anti-Semitism. Vienna at the time was a melting pot of cultures, but it was also a place where nationalist and ethnic rivalries ran deep. Hitler absorbed many of these prejudices, and his early exposure to extremist political ideas began shaping his worldview. Despite his difficult circumstances, he was not entirely without purpose. He read extensively: history, politics, architecture, and the works of German nationalist writers. This self-education, combined with his growing bitterness over his personal failures, began to fuse into a rigid set of beliefs about race, nationhood, and leadership. He came to see the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire as inevitable and believed that the strength of the German people was being undermined by outside influences. In 1908, his mother died of cancer, a loss that deeply affected him. Without her support, he was entirely on his own. Life became a struggle for survival, and his resentment towards society hardened. He spent much of his time discussing politics in coffee houses, where debates about national identity, the future of Europe, and the role of different ethnic groups were common. By 1913, Hitler had decided to leave Vienna and move to Munich, Germany. The move was partly motivated by his desire to avoid serving in the Austro-Hungarian military, which he viewed as representing a state he had no loyalty toward. In Munich, he found a city more in line with his cultural ideals, German-speaking, steeped in art and history, yet also politically unstable. His time in Munich was relatively quiet at first, but events soon arose that would dramatically change his life. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 triggered the outbreak of the First World War. Hitler saw this as an opportunity to prove himself and to serve a cause he believed in. He volunteered for the German army, marking the end of his drifting years and the beginning of a new chapter. The struggles, disappointments, and ideological formation of his early life had set the foundation for the path he would follow, a path that would eventually lead him from obscurity to the center of world events. This period of hardship and personal challenge did not just shape his ambitions, it also deepened the convictions that would later define his political identity. His rejection from the art world, his experiences of poverty, and his exposure to intense political rhetoric all combined to create a young man with a rigid, uncompromising view of the world. The early seeds of his future actions had been planted long before he stepped into the public eye. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Adolf Hitler was living in Munich. He volunteered for the German army and was accepted into the Bavarian regiment. Life as a soldier brought him a sense of belonging and purpose he had never felt before. He served as a dispatch runner, carrying critical messages across dangerous front lines, and earned a reputation for bravery. The war was brutal, but he thrived in the structured environment, forming a strong bond with his fellow soldiers. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel and once in a gas attack that temporarily blinded him. These experiences left physical scars, but the psychological impact was deeper. The eventual defeat of Germany in 1918 came as a personal shock. Hitler, like many veterans, felt betrayed. The stab in the back myth, a belief that Germany's army had been undermined by internal enemies such as politicians, communists, and Jews, took root in his mind. He could not accept that the German forces had been beaten on the battlefield. Instead, he believed the loss was the result of treachery. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, confirmed these feelings. The treaty imposed severe reparations, reduced the size of the military, and stripped Germany of territory. For Hitler, it was a humiliation that demanded reversal. After the war, Germany was in chaos. The economy was collapsing, unemployment was widespread, and political violence filled the streets. Left-wing and right-wing militias clashed regularly, and the Weimar Republic struggled to maintain control. Hitler remained in the army for a time, not in combat but in administrative roles. His duties included monitoring political groups, and in September 1919, this task led him to attend a meeting of the German Workers' Party. At first, the party was small and obscure, but Hitler was impressed by its nationalist, anti-communist, and anti-Semitic positions. He quickly became a member and discovered his ability to speak in a way that stirred emotion and held attention. His speeches were direct, forceful, and filled with vivid imagery. He targeted feelings of anger, resentment, and pride, telling audiences that Germany could rise again if it united behind a strong leadership and removed those he portrayed as enemies. By 1920, he was deeply involved in the party's activities, helping to shape its platform and direction. He pushed for a new name, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, and played a central role in creating its symbols and slogans. Hitler's rise within the organization was rapid. His oratory drew larger and larger crowds, and he became the face of the movement. The party developed a paramilitary wing, the SA, Storm Detachment, to protect meetings and intimidate rivals. By 1923, inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, Hitler believed the Nazis could seize power in Germany through a coup. The opportunity seemed ripe when political instability in Bavaria appeared to open the door for bold action. On November 8, 1923, Hitler and his followers attempted what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. They stormed a political meeting in Munich, declaring a national revolution. The plan was to march on Berlin and overthrow the government. However, the coup failed almost immediately. The police responded with force, killing several Nazis and scattering the rest. Hitler was arrested and charged with treason. The trial that followed became a platform for him to promote his ideas to a national audience. He admitted to his actions but framed them as an act of patriotism. His speeches during the proceedings were widely reported, gaining him recognition far beyond Munich. The court sentenced him to 5 years in prison, but he served only about 9 months. During his time in Landsberg prison, Hitler wrote the first volume of Mein Kampf. The book outlined his ideology, including extreme nationalism, racial theories, and his vision for Germany's future. He argued for the expansion of German territory, the rejection of the Versailles Treaty, and the removal of groups he saw as threats. Although Mein Kampf was not immediately a bestseller, it provided a clear statement of his political blueprint. When released in December 1924, Hitler found the Nazi Party in disarray. He worked to rebuild it, focusing on a legal path to power rather than another violent coup. The lessons of the failed putsch convinced him that control of the state could be achieved through elections and strategic alliances. He reorganized the party, expanded propaganda efforts, and strengthened its paramilitary forces. This approach would define the next stage of his political career, as he set his sights on turning a fringe movement into a force capable of dominating German politics. So the momentum stays intact. By the late 1920s, Germany's political landscape was unstable, and the economic situation was fragile. The Great Depression in 1929 plunged the country into deep crisis. Banks collapsed, businesses failed, and unemployment soared to unprecedented levels. Millions of Germans faced poverty and desperation. The Weimar government appeared powerless, and public trust in traditional political parties eroded. In this climate, Adolf Hitler saw a chance to transform the Nazi Party from a minor movement into a national power. He used the hardships to present himself as the only leader capable of restoring Germany's pride and strength. His speeches promised jobs, stability, and the revival of national honor. He skillfully blamed the crisis on the Treaty of Versailles, corrupt politicians, communists, and Jews, offering a clear target for public frustration. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, amplified these messages through posters, newspapers, radio broadcasts, and mass rallies. The image of Hitler as a disciplined, decisive leader was cultivated carefully, appealing to those yearning for order. Election results reflected the growing appeal. In 1928, the Nazis had only a small presence in the Reichstag. By 1930, they became the second largest party, riding a wave of economic despair and nationalist sentiment. Hitler's ability to connect emotionally with crowds gave him an advantage over opponents who relied on dry political arguments. He presented himself not as a politician, but as a savior of the nation. Despite electoral gains, the Nazis lacked a majority, and Germany's politics remained fractured. Hitler understood the necessity of alliances. He reassured conservative elites, industrialists, and military leaders that his movement would defend their interests while restoring order. Some saw him as a tool they could control, underestimating his ambition and determination. By 1932, Hitler ran for the presidency against Paul von Hindenburg, the respected war hero and incumbent. Hitler lost, but his campaign raised his profile even higher. The Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag after the July 1932 elections, yet political deadlock persisted. Hitler refused to accept any position short of the chancellorship, rejecting offers for lower offices. Powerful backroom negotiations followed. Franz von Papen and other influential figures believed that appointing Hitler as chancellor, within a cabinet dominated by conservatives, would allow them to use his popularity while keeping him in check. On January 30, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Many in the political elite assumed they had secured control over him, but events soon proved otherwise. Once in office, Hitler moved quickly to consolidate power. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 was used as a pretext to push through the Reichstag fire decree, suspending civil liberties and allowing the arrest of political opponents without trial. Communist leaders were among the first targets, but the crackdown extended to anyone viewed as a threat. In March 1933, the Enabling Act passed, giving Hitler's government the authority to enact laws without parliamentary approval. This effectively dismantled democratic processes and established a legal dictatorship. The Nazis took control of state institutions, dissolved rival parties, and replaced officials with loyal supporters. The SA and newly formed SS enforced compliance through intimidation and violence. Public support grew as unemployment fell and visible national projects began, such as the construction of the Autobahn. Economic policies combined public works with rearmament, creating jobs and fostering a sense of revival. Propaganda celebrated these achievements, presenting them as proof of Hitler's leadership. At the same time, repressive measures intensified. Dissenting voices were silenced, and persecution of Jews and other targeted groups became official policy. By the mid-1930s, Hitler had transformed Germany into a one-party state with himself at its center. His authority extended over every aspect of life, reinforced by a blend of fear, loyalty, and carefully crafted imagery. The combination of economic recovery, nationalistic pride, and strict control convinced many Germans that the nation had entered a new era of strength. This complete grip on power prepared the ground for the aggressive foreign policies and military actions that would soon follow, pushing Germany toward a path that would reshape the world. Once Adolf Hitler had complete control over Germany, he turned his focus outward. His goal was to overturn the post-World War I order and expand German territory. The first steps came without firing a shot. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a region that had been demilitarized under the Treaty of Versailles. The move violated international agreements, but Britain and France offered no military response. This emboldened Hitler to push further. 2 years later, Austria was annexed in the Anschluss of March 1938. German forces entered to cheering crowds, and Austria was incorporated into the Reich. The international community again avoided confrontation, believing appeasement might preserve peace. That same year, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a significant ethnic German population. Britain and France agreed to the Munich Agreement, granting the territory in exchange for his promise of no further expansion. Within months, however, he broke that promise, occupying the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. These actions made war inevitable. In August 1939, Hitler struck a surprising deal with Joseph Stalin, the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. Secret clauses divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, ensuring that the Soviet Union would not oppose German plans in Poland. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland using blitzkrieg tactics, fast, coordinated strikes with aircraft, tanks, and infantry. Britain and France declared war, marking the start of the Second World War. The early years of the conflict saw rapid German victories. Denmark and Norway fell in April 1940, securing access to vital resources and strategic ports. In May, Hitler launched his attack on Western Europe, bypassing the heavily fortified French border by moving through Belgium and the Netherlands. Paris fell within 6 weeks, and France surrendered in June. The speed and scale of these successes stunned the world. Next came an attempt to force Britain into submission. The Battle of Britain in mid-1940 became a fierce air campaign. The Luftwaffe bombed military targets and later civilian areas in the Blitz, but Britain's Royal Air Force resisted, and Hitler eventually abandoned plans for invasion. Attention shifted toward the east. In June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, against the Soviet Union. Initial advances were massive, capturing vast territories and encircling entire Soviet armies. However, the campaign slowed as German forces faced supply problems, fierce resistance, and the onset of the brutal Russian winter. The failure to capture Moscow before the end of 1941 marked the beginning of strategic difficulties. That same year, Germany's alliance with Japan drew it into conflict with the United States. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Hitler declared war on the U.S., turning the war into a truly global conflict. While his forces still controlled much of Europe, Germany now faced powerful enemies on multiple fronts. In North Africa, the Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel achieved initial victories, but by late 1942, the tide began to turn. The defeat at El Alamein and Allied advances from both East and West pushed German forces into retreat. In the East, the Battle of Stalingrad became a turning point. German troops, ordered by Hitler to hold their positions at all costs, were encircled and forced to surrender in February 1943. The loss shattered the myth of German invincibility. From then on, the Allies pushed forward. Soviet forces drove westward, reclaiming territory and advancing toward Germany. In the air, relentless bombing campaigns targeted German cities, industry, and infrastructure, weakening the war effort. In Italy, the Allies landed in 1943, removing Mussolini from power and opening another front. Despite worsening conditions, Hitler refused to consider negotiation. He believed unwavering determination could still bring victory, even as his armies were steadily forced back. The war he had set in motion was beginning to consume the empire he had built, and the final stages were approaching. The defeats piling up on every front would soon bring the collapse of his vision for a dominant, expanded Reich. By 1944, Germany's fortunes had sharply declined. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June opened a western front, forcing German forces to fight on three major fronts: west against the Americans and British, east against the Soviets, and south in Italy. The D-Day landings and rapid Allied advance through France broke the defensive line, and Paris was liberated by August. In the east, Soviet offensives smashed through German positions, reclaiming vast territories and moving steadily toward Berlin. The Luftwaffe, once a dominant force, was crippled by losses and fuel shortages, unable to stop relentless bombing raids that devastated German cities and industry. Inside the Reich, shortages of food, fuel, and resources worsened. Civilians endured constant air raids, and morale collapsed. Hitler, increasingly isolated in his Berlin bunker, refused to acknowledge the scale of the disaster. He issued orders for counterattacks that were impossible to carry out, dismissing generals who disagreed and replacing them with loyal but inexperienced officers. The Ardennes Offensive in December 1944, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, was his last major attempt to reverse the war's course. It briefly surprised the Allies but quickly failed, exhausting what remained of Germany's reserves. In early 1945, the Soviet Red Army launched a massive assault from the east, crushing resistance and pushing deep into German territory. Cities fell one after another as the front moved toward the capital. Meanwhile, the Allies advanced across the Rhine, entering western Germany. With defeat certain, many of Hitler's closest allies began to distance themselves or seek separate negotiations. The reality of total collapse could no longer be ignored, yet Hitler refused to surrender. By April, Soviet forces had encircled Berlin. The city became the scene of intense street fighting, with defenders made up of regular troops, police units, and even untrained civilians. Artillery bombardments reduced entire districts to rubble. In the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's physical health had deteriorated. His hands trembled, and he appeared aged far beyond his years. Still, he continued to give orders detached from battlefield realities, insisting that relief armies would arrive, armies that no longer existed. On April 29, 1945, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony within the bunker. The following day, as Soviet troops closed in, he dictated his final will and political testament, blaming Jews for the war and urging future generations to continue his ideology. That afternoon, he and Braun took their own lives. Their bodies were burned by loyal aides to prevent them from being captured. Without his leadership, the remaining Nazi hierarchy quickly unraveled. Joseph Goebbels, appointed as Hitler's successor in his will, committed suicide with his family the next day. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz assumed nominal control and attempted to negotiate surrender terms. On May 7, Germany officially surrendered to the Allies, and the war in Europe ended the following day. The destruction left in the war's wake was immense. Tens of millions were dead across Europe, cities lay in ruins, and entire nations were shattered. The full extent of Nazi atrocities became known as Allied troops liberated concentration camps, revealing the systematic extermination of millions of Jews, Romani people, political prisoners, and others. These crimes shocked the world and defined the moral reckoning that followed. In the aftermath, the Nuremberg trials were held to prosecute key figures of the Nazi regime for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. Many top officials were convicted and executed, while others received long prison sentences. The trials established important precedents in international law, underscoring that leaders could be held personally accountable for their actions. Hitler's legacy became one of destruction, mass suffering, and a warning about the dangers of totalitarianism, unchecked power, and extremist ideology. His rise and fall demonstrated how economic hardship, political instability, and skillful manipulation of public sentiment could enable a movement that plunged the world into catastrophe. The collapse of the Third Reich left Germany divided and under occupation, beginning a long process of rebuilding and confronting its past. The story of Hitler's final months and the downfall of his regime stands as a stark reminder of how absolute power, once gained, can lead not to glory, but to ruin.